Hello, everybody, and welcome to what typically is our last sort of official lecture for Psych 200. It's not necessarily the last time that you're going to see a recording, the last time I'd be standing in front of the class for this course, but it is the last topic that we would cover before our final quiz of the semester. Obviously, with everything being kind of out of disorder right now, that's not necessarily the case for this semester, but it is going to be the last big piece of information that we're going to be covering. But as I mentioned in our previous lecture, what we're going to be looking at today is sort of a transition away from a lot of the specific things that we've been discussing in the past. It's almost kind of a return to some of the stuff that we were covering in the very beginning of the semester when we were just kind of laying the groundwork for what was really important to cover and what we need to know in a research methods class. But I'd like to have this particular topic at the very end of the semester because it's an essential piece to making sure that students leave this class with a grounded understanding of what's in front of them and some of the things that they need to concern themselves as they're progressing. So what is it that we're going to be covering today? Well, what we're going to be doing in this lecture and sort of in the next one, which again is kind of a lecture, kind of more just a walkthrough on an activity that we're going to be doing, is covering how to be an ethical researcher. And when we're talking about being an ethical researcher, essentially ethical research is something that we have to consider under two umbrellas: ethical research for animals and ethical research for humans. Oftentimes there is a perfect overlap between how to be ethical in both camps, but there are some differences when looking at the scope of ethical concerns and also some of the things that you might need to be trained with in these two different areas where you're doing research on the mind, but through these different mediums. So in this class, we're going to be trying to understand ethical research and what's important in both types of studies, even if you're only going to be focusing on one throughout the entirety of your undergraduate career and maybe future career. It's probably important just to kind of understand the other one as well. What I'd like to do in this class, typically when trying to explore this idea of ethical research, is have people first brainstorm some examples of situations where ethical guidelines or ethical standards weren't necessarily met by people. Typically, we have people get into groups, and I say, what I want you to do is think of some things that you need to concern yourself when it comes to animal research, and then after you're done talking about this for a few minutes, think about some things that you would concern yourself with when you're conducting human research. And what people typically do when we're doing this activity is they start looking at famous historical studies that relate to kind of unethical behavior. The classic example of this is the Milgram shock experiment that you see depicted here in this video, or not this video, sorry, this image. The image is actually of Stanley Milgram with his famous shock meter, where he supposedly asked people to shock people to levels that would probably kill another person, when in reality he was just kind of looking at how well these individuals conformed to authority figures, or what he called obeyed. There's lots of other examples of unethical research that you probably are aware of in your mind right now, since most of you are sophomores, juniors, and beyond, that really highlights how, especially in the social sciences, we have a need to ensure that we are mindful of what it means to be an ethical researcher, both with animals and humans, because unfortunately, there are lots of opportunities to disobey these ethical standards, and there's lots of people in our history that have done this. So being extra cautious, extra aware of this is critical in our social sciences, which is again why we tend to cover this at the very end of the semester instead of just in the beginning or someplace in between, where we can really put an emphasis on this and hopefully have you take it home with you as you're progressing in some of your future upper division classes. So what are some issues then when it comes to our classic kind of problems that we encounter with human research? As I mentioned, people oftentimes in that activity that we do tend to focus on specific studies. The classic one is that Stanley Milgram obedience experiment, but I'm certain that at some point somebody within the class would have also mentioned another classic study where there were some ethical issues, which is Philip Zimbardo's what's called the Stanford Prison Study, where he had college-age students, and actually people in the community, it wasn't just students, come in and take on the roles of either prisoners or prison guards. And he wanted to explore how just being arbitrarily assigned these roles could cause people to dramatically shift their behaviors. What he found was that these behaviors were shifted even more, and he allowed this study to continue even while participants were abusing others and kind of causing a situation that was already slightly askew to escalate and get way out of hand within the matter of a few days. Now, there's also issues with Zimbardo's experiment that have been uncovered recently where he actually cajoled or forced many of his participants to take things to the extremes that they were reported as to kind of having taken them to. There's also some reports about the earnestness in the kind of feelings of abuse and problems that some of the prisoners encountered. Essentially, some prisoners recently were interviewed about a decade ago, saying that a lot of the things that they did and the things that they said that they were suffering from were really just staged, and they were done at the behest of Zimbardo and his staff. This particular study is riddled with lots of ethical issues. I still like talking about it, honestly, in my social psych classes because there's lots of very powerful implications behind it. But at the heart of it, we see a ton of ethical concerns that we want to be mindful of as good researchers. We're looking beyond just not doing harm to individuals psychologically. There's also, unfortunately, lots of studies that we've had in our past where we've gone beyond that. The classic example of research that's gone astray over time because of changing circumstances is something called the Tuskegee experiments. Now, my guess is that around 25 to 50% of the class is familiar with the Tuskegee experiments. Some people are very familiar with it and kind of consider it that this huge moment in their life when they learned about these particular studies. But I'm guaranteeing that there are a large number of people in this class that have never heard of the Tuskegee experiments and don't know much about why it's cited as a big issue when it comes to ethical research. So what I did was provide you with the YouTube link of a video that does have some questionable language when describing the issues surrounding the Tuskegee experiment, but when you watch it, hopefully you can get from this YouTube video kind of an overview of the experiment and what it was that made it this kind of monumental thing that we still cite decades later as is kind of a prime example of why we need some type of ethical standards in our research. This is what we're going to really be focusing on today. What it is to be ethical, how it is that a researcher can be ethical with this litany of problems that we've had in our past. And a lot of this will focus on what we're doing while we're conducting our research, but there's other things that you need to consider when you're trying to be an ethical researcher. Making sure that you're obtaining information that's not problematic is big. How you're obtaining that information and what you're doing with it is also really important to understand. There's also some kind of unexpected things that pop up that are really important to mention in a class like this. Like when you're being an ethical researcher, being aware of sensitive populations is a key thing. In our very first day of class, I asked the class to talk about some things that they might want to study for a senior project. And as anticipated, a large number of individuals talked about wanting to do studies on things like family abuse and mental health issues and other things that were really kind of passion projects and things that people might want to pursue even after they're done with their career at Cal State East Bay. Certainly not that these particular pursuits aren't worthwhile. In fact, I encourage many of you to continue down those paths and pursue these things, look into these things that you find interesting. But at the same time, when we're looking at these things in terms of how to be a good researcher, understand that trying to explore these things, especially as undergraduates, is a really risky thing. If you're looking at individuals who have been abused or people with mental health issues, you're looking at what we call sensitive populations. And these populations can experience harm and can react to things in a way that is disproportionate from the rest of the population. Essentially, you can do more harm to these individuals than you can do to most individuals just by doing small, subtle things to them in your experimental or observational studies. So making sure that you're mindful of these groups is a key concern of a lot of people setting up ethical standards and guidelines. It's why there's usually extra red tape that you have to go through if you do have aspirations of studying topics like this. Again, it's not that you shouldn't study these things, it's just that we have a desire in our attempts to be ethical to kind of make sure that people are doing research on these topics or on these groups in very specific ways. The other thing that's really important to understand when we're talking about how to be an ethical researcher is that we don't just oftentimes say, these are the things you need to do. Instead, what we often do when getting people familiar with how we become ethical researchers is we direct them to something called the American Psychological Association's Human Subjects Guidelines. Because in the American Psychological Association, there's lots of publications that have been put out there that really lay out exactly what not only researchers should themselves do, but also how institutes should really monitor this type of research and kind of encourage people to behave in specific ways if they are going to do research under the name of whatever institute that they're a part of. We're looking for some of the key elements to the American Psychological Association's Human Subjects Guidelines. Some of the ones that are really big and pushed are listed here. Obviously, the first and most important thing that's critical to be an ethical researcher is to, as we talked about, do no harm. That's both physical and psychological harm, not only when these participants are a part of the study, but also afterwards. This is something that's a real issue in psychology, unfortunately, and it's something that's still sometimes a problem when people run these studies. They maybe weren't necessarily causing immediate harm to individuals, but that the kind of long-term consequences aren't always thought through by lots of people starting out their careers in psychology. So there's guidelines that the American Psychological Association has set up to kind of help people as they navigate in these waters for the first time so they don't do any either physical or mental harm to individuals over the long run. Another thing that's really pushed by the American Psychological Association is that because we are studying a sensitive topic, lots of different aspects of the mind can be not necessarily taboo, but not things that lots of people want to talk about with large numbers of individuals. Because of that, there is a concern if we're going to be reporting information that we try to detach the individual from the information obtained. That's why there's lots of specific guidelines within the American Psychological Association's publications that the kind of detail how we're supposed to ensure the privacy and confidentiality of people participating in the studies. So they're not only capable of kind of not being tracked in the meantime while they're participating in the study, but afterwards, after they've completed the projects and helped out with some of our scientific endeavors to kind of help people do this. The APA also really sets up the standards that schools themselves should have to not only vet the research that people are doing, but kind of ensure that when people are conducting their studies, that they're meeting all of the different guidelines and standards that the American Psychological Association has set out. So there's very, very few schools now, in the United States at least, that don't have very specific programs that we'll talk about later called institutional review boards. So they can actually ensure that people are making sure that they're following the American Psychological Association's guidelines and the institutes, the schools' guidelines for how to be an ethical researcher. And a lot of this also, if we're looking for it, involves lots of training. So the APA really sets out not only what information people need to know, but how we can verify that people have learned this information. There's specific training programs like the one we're going to be talking about a little bit later called the CITI program. There's another one that you might encounter somewhere along the way called the NSF program. that all have training that is designed to kind of align people's understanding of how to be an ethical researcher with those that have been set out by the American Psychological Association. And this goes again beyond just that only running the studies, but kind of how we obtain that information within the studies and keep that information so we can ensure that, again, people's privacy, confidentiality is not an issue, and that we're doing things in a way that kind of ensure unanticipated ethical issues that would be met later on. We'll talk about this a little bit later as well when we talk about follow-up studies and replicating studies to ensure that people are doing things in the right way. If we're looking at other things that are really critical components to research, there are some other things that the APA has set out as a critical aspect of all research. One of the things that many researchers have to be trained in and really work a lot of time on once they've designed their studies are these things called informed consent sheets. These sheets are essentially contracts between the researcher and participants. So not only the researchers know how the ethical guidelines of the APA and other institutes are being met, but how they themselves can gauge whether or not they're feeling like they're being treated ethically in the study. Most schools have their own standards for what it means to run an appropriate informed consent sheet, but at every school, when they're trying to design what's an appropriate informed consent sheet, that there are some standards that the APA has set out in their publications and their kind of critiques of schools that many schools are trying to kind of follow under the umbrella of. In terms of what's standard in most informed consent sheets, one of the things that's critical in them is that you aren't telling participants before they participate in the study what it is you're going to do. Obviously, if there is a need for deception or at least not telling everything, there is ways to do this in studies. If the entire point of the study is ruined by telling somebody exactly what you're doing, you don't have to always tell people exactly what the point of things are, but having some sense of what's going to happen, the general point of a study, is something the American Psychological Association is very insistent people do. Another thing that's really important in informed consent sheets, it's kind of universal across universities, is that there has to be some contingency plan put in place. What that means is if somebody decides they don't want to participate in the study, once they hear about what it's like, or while they're participating, they decide they want to withdraw, the participants need to be informed in advance of what the consequences of this withdrawal will be. Usually, it's kind of important to just stress to people that you do have the right to pull out without any repercussions, where you're not going to be penalized for this, or there aren't going to be any problems that kind of result from your decision not to continue in a study. This also relates to another big important thing that all informed consent sheets have, and that's there's some mention of any potential consequences or benefits that could come from these studies. There's not a lot of psychology studies that have tons of consequences unless there is the potential for psychological harm, which surprisingly there can be studies where unexpected consequences like this can happen. But usually in most psych research, the things listed here are the benefits. Is there some type of financial compensation for participating, or do people earn some type of course credit for this? This is something that needs to be included in these informed consent sheets so people have a very clear understanding of what they're going to get before they even start participating in these studies. And if there are compensations involved, another thing that's important to list is what are the alternatives if somebody does decide that they want to participate, but they don't want to participate in this particular study. They wanted to either again decline participation or withdraw participation as it's progressing. Laying that out in advance is again a kind of universal thing in informed consent sheets. You do need to discuss with participants also their confidentiality and kind of how to contact people if they have questions. And all of these things, again, are standard with these informed consent sheets that are, again, provided to people before they participate in the studies. Essentially, the APA, the American Psychological Association, has instructed lots of institutions and researchers as to kind of what should generally be provided in these. And then most institutions have kind of their specific framework or skeletons that people use to write their own specific informed consent sheets. If you want an example of this, I actually pulled one off the internet that looked at informed consent on a study that was looking at kind of different types of care that people were experiencing. This one, if I recall correctly, was being done in a lab in Canada. And this is, if you could look at it a little bit more closely, just a rough overview that maybe researchers within this lab were given, and then the specifics of the study were kind of embedded within it when they were going to start running the study. It's not necessarily, again, a universal informed consent sheet. Each school is going to have its own skeleton, as I like to call it, giving people the basics that they need to include in it, but allowing them the flexibility to add their own meat, their own details, to really round out these informed consent sheets and give people all the required information that's included in there. It's not, again, the universal one, but if you have a sense of what they look like, you're better off than many individuals who unfortunately go into research without knowledge of what these informed consent sheets are. Again, once these informed consent sheets are provided to individuals, you do have to ensure that they do have the right to withdraw. But another thing that you have to think about when you're being an ethical researcher, which is kind of counterintuitive, is that you make sure that you're offering an appropriate amount of inducements when people do agree to participate in your studies. This means not only offering more than what's considered too little, so more credit than nothing, or more money than just kind of a measly amount, but it also means not offering too much. Because if you incentivize participation in the study too much, you might entice people to participate in studies that they're extremely uncomfortable with participating in. I mean, let's say you, as an undergraduate, were offered thousands of dollars to participate in a study that was going to do lots of undue harm to you. Well, you might, as an undergraduate, especially if you're starting financially, be willing to participate in those studies, recognizing that that money could go a long way at this moment in your life. And that's not necessarily an ethical thing. Just because you need the money now doesn't mean you should be willing to sacrifice your health by physical and mental because of it. But unfortunately, sometimes we don't make the right decisions over the long term because of the immediate impact that these inducements can have. So the APA has essentially stepped in and say you have to be more ethical as a researcher, where you don't entice people to participate in things that they're uncomfortable with just because of the kind of magnitude of the inducement that you're providing. Again, they do have guidelines also on kind of how much you can deceive or whether or not you can even deceive in your studies. And the other thing that they ask many researchers to do in many institutes to kind of standardize is what's called a debriefing sheet. Now, these debriefing sheets or debriefing statements tend to kind of be the other end of the book from the informed consent sheets or the informed consent statements that people are given when they participate in studies. So you've got the first bookend telling people what you're going to do, then you do something, and then at the end you tell them kind of what you did. Now, the catch to debriefing statements is it can also allow you to kind of inform people about some things that you maybe omitted or deceive them about when you were presenting them information about the study in the first place. It can essentially clear the air on what the real point of the study was if you couldn't necessarily tell it to these individuals before they started participating in. And much like informed consent sheets, most institutes have their own templates, their own skeletons that people use, but obviously they need to add their specific details, their specific information to really round them out. And it's really important if you do start working on your studies that you really focus your attention not only on the informed consent sheets, but also these debriefing statements, since many people will take these things home and keep that information with them if something does arise. And making sure that you've covered all your bases is really important in these debriefing statements. So many schools scrutinize not only those informed consent sheets, but also these debriefing statements to again ensure that people are being as ethical as possible when they're running their research studies. With that being said, I think this is probably a good time right now to take a little bit of a break. We just got a few more slides left. And essentially, what we're going to be doing is transitioning our attention away from how to be an ethical researcher with humans to how to be an ethical researcher with animals. But I think both you and I probably need a little bit of a mental break right now. So let's take a few minutes off, walk around, walk the dogs, go for a run, do whatever, and come back and try to tackle this idea of how to be an ethical researcher with animals. So I'll see you all back here in just a few minutes. Take care. All right. Welcome back. In this next portion of the video, we are going to, as I mentioned, talk about how the American Psychological Association has also set out guidelines for animal research. Because not only do they care about how to be an ethical researcher both with humans, but also with animals as well. And when we're looking at animal research, it's really important to note that even though there is structurally a lot of similarity between how to be an ethical researcher with humans as there is with animals, there are some deviations from the kind of standards that we have with humans when we start talking about research with animals. Obviously, one of the big things that's thrown out the window when we're doing research with animals is we don't necessarily have informed consent sheets, debriefing statements. There's not necessarily a lot of concerns when it comes to deception, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everything that we've talked about before in terms of needing to be an ethical researcher is thrown out the window just because these concerns are no longer present. When people start turning their attention to animal research, there's lots of different things to talk about when it comes to doing no harm. Usually you don't have to, when you're doing research, concern yourself, or research with humans that is, concern yourself with the environment that these humans are living in, and you're kind of providing them with while they participate in your studies. It's just not a lot of studies where that's something that might pop up with human research. But with most animal research, this is definitely something that you have to be mindful of. Most animals that are studied in labs tend to be also housed in those labs. And the APA really stresses that how you acquire these animals through different farms and different places that have specifically bred these animals for research, how you care for them, and also when they do pass, because all animals will eventually pass, just like everybody, we kind of ensure that we're doing this in an ethical way. So this not only has the American Psychological Association really stepped in on this, but there are lots of federally mandated laws that say if you're going to be doing research with animals, regardless of which profession you're in, not just psychology, you do want to make sure that you're doing it in a standardized way that kind of minimizes the amount of problems that you're causing for these animals. Usually, these concerns, when it comes to acquiring, caring for, and disposing of these animals, focus on some of the issues that you also have as a researcher. You're not creating a lot of discomfort or pain or inflicting different problems in these individuals unless these things are related specifically to what you're interested in. I do have to acknowledge here that when we are doing animal research, uh, when researchers are doing animal research, there is oftentimes some type of harm involved. That's why oftentimes people choose to do research on a topic with animals and not human beings. But that there is a push when people are forced to do animal research to kind of minimize the harm and discomfort that you're doing and really focus that harm and discomfort only on things that are necessary. And to ensure that this particular process is done, most people in this profession who do research with animals on a regular basis require extensive amounts of training. At Cal State East Bay, very few labs actually utilize animals in their research, partially because it's very time consuming and financially expensive to do studies with animals, also because of the ethical concerns related to it in general, whether or not we should be using animals for research. But at Cal State East Bay, another big issue that kind of pops up is most people who do research with animals tend to be graduate students or faculty members because there is usually months to years of training that's required and constant vigilant updates of that training to ensure that people are meeting all the different guidelines. Not only, again, in kind of how to do research with these animals, but how to properly care for them while they're participants in your study. And a lot of the proper care, acquisition, all these other things related to kind of how to be ethical with these researchers goes beyond just the scope of animal behavior or kind of a proper treatment. It gets into things like medicine, where you need to learn how to provide anesthesia appropriately. You need to how to learn how to kind of measure the weight of animals and maintain it in different conditions. And you have to be kind of familiar with how to sanitize and care for these animals when they're participating in these studies. And sometimes, if your study does eventually involve the termination of life, you need to make sure that you understand how to do it in what's considered the most ethically manner possible. Obviously, again, this is not necessarily a part of every animal study, but when the termination of life is the end of the study, you have to be at least mindful of what it means to be, if we can call it ethical, ethical in your termination of the life of these individuals. So essentially, when people are doing animal research, again, as I mentioned before, there are lots of standards that we have for animals that we also had for humans, but there's lots of extra things that we have to wrap into how to be an appropriate animal researcher because of the nuanced differences between human participants and animal participants in the research that we're interested in. And this is why oftentimes when schools do these things, again, they not only require extensive amounts of training, but they've also tried to, because it is really tough to acquire animals and there's lots of concerns with the proper disposal of them, where schools have started to kind of shift their thinking on studies. Historically, when people were running studies with animals, they tended to use animals for one study and then terminate their life after they were done with the study. Most institutes that aren't doing extremely invasive research will oftentimes, if the animals can kind of leave the studies unharmed, continue to participate in a multitude of different studies. There's behavioral labs all over the world that actually have rats and other species kind of go through their entire life cycle while participating in the lab, where they just die of old age eventually, because there is no undue harm incurred upon them and there's no concerns with carryover effects from one study to another. The interesting thing that we sometimes get into with these types of studies when animals can live this long is how much prior learning and prior exposure could potentially differentiate the response that these animals are giving from other animals. And also, something kind of linked to this, which is kind of interesting, is how much more or less there's animals and their behaviors reflective of human beings when they are exposed to a multitude of different things instead of just one or two things before their life is terminated. Another thing that's kind of interesting in terms of new trends in different labs and other areas is that many labs try their best to train everybody regardless of exactly what aspect of research you're doing with animals, kind of in a holistic way. So there are these things, again, that we're going to talk about in our next class called institutional review boards that not only kind of train people on how to be a good researcher overall, but many labs also train people in the exact things that they're going to be doing, not only in their aspect of the project, but everybody else's aspect of the project. So everybody's 100% aware of what's critical in these studies. And most labs are very vigilant with this, not only because they want to be ethical, but most schools also have very intense, punitive kind of actions that are taken on labs when people don't behave in an ethical way. I unfortunately had a colleague when I was a graduate student that was running a behavioral lab with rats, where an undergraduate participant was actually bitten by one of the rats that was participating in the study, not because the rat was being aggressive necessarily, but because she did not hold the rat appropriately. And unfortunately, when she got bit and had to report it, because this is kind of the ethical standards, there was an identification that this particular research assistant had not been trained in how to properly handle these animals, and she wasn't doing it in the right way. So the lab was actually kicked out of the behavioral space. I think it was for 2 years, if I recall correctly. And this is kind of the standard that many schools hold lots of animal researchers to, where there is this need to kind of have redundancy in training that can sometimes feel exhaustive as a researcher, simply because there are so many different things that you have to think about when you're running research with animals and you're trying to do it in an ethical manner. That idea of being an ethical researcher with animals and humans, though, is not necessarily where I want to end today's class. These are two very important things, obviously, that you have to think about when you're trying to be an ethical researcher. But another thing that I really want students to think about when we talk about being an ethical researcher is that ethical research goes beyond just the collection of data. Once you have data in your hands, there's still a litany of different ways that you can be unethical, and you want to be mindful of kind of people potentially being unethical in when you're critiquing and understanding the research of others. If we're looking to kind of whittle down or boil down some of the major issues that pop up afterwards that we tend to call fraud, there's three big things that most people can sometimes commit that kind of indicate that they're behaving unethically even after even after they've run the study. One of the things, unfortunately, that sometimes researchers have been known to do is simply lying about the data or interpreting things in ways that they know full well when they're running the studies or after they're analyzing the studies is kind of pushing the data in a way to confirm or kind of give them the results that they're looking for. And this is something that's especially important to cover in a psychology class because in the last decade or so, we've actually gone through a revolution looking at how common this particular type of unethical behavior is. And around 2010, there were all these publications started to come out that talked about this thing in social psychology and personality psychology called the replication crisis, where lots of people had built their names up in the late 1900s and early 2000s and published these really interesting studies that when people were trying to replicate them, couldn't necessarily be replicated. And originally, it was thought to be kind of just a statistical anomaly, something that was just random chance. But if we kind of tweak things or found a way to match up with the kind of design of the original researcher, we should be able to kind of find what they were finding. But as time passed and multiple replications were done, and many of these studies that just weren't panning out when they were attempted to be replicated, but we started to realize that there was the possibility that were a large number of individuals, again, especially in social psychology and personality psychology, that were maybe bending the truth or maybe massaging the data in a way that they needed to in order to get the results that they could. Essentially, it goes back to those demand characteristics that we talked about before, but it goes beyond that. And when we talk about interpreting data and looking at things through things like observational studies or responses that are a little bit more open-ended, there is a concern, unfortunately, with how often people manipulate the information that they're analyzing to get the results that they want. And this oftentimes, unfortunately, goes hand in hand with another big issue that can pop up where people do something called omitting data or overstepping the data that they have. Omitting data is kind of interesting. Let me show you a chart as to what I'm talking about here. So let's say you run a study. It's a correlational study, and you want to show a regression line exists in the two data points that you're interested in that looks like the red line depicted here. But you recognize that you're not getting that red line when you try to draw what we sometimes call a regression line or best fit line through the data points that exist. It's just not coming up. And after scouring through the data, you come to conclude that it's primarily an issue with the people in the three people actually in the upper left hand corner. they're really messing with your data. They're screwing up that correlation that you're looking for. So let's say you peer into their lives a little bit more and you recognize that, well, maybe one of them was wearing glasses while they were participating, the one was wearing a hat, and most people in the other groups weren't doing that. So you essentially find a way to justify the ability to just remove them from the study. Well, in doing so, what you're unfortunately doing is, yes, strengthening your chances of finding things, but you're underrepresenting a big chunk of the population. It's not that those people weren't necessarily causing third or extraneous variable problems, but you as an ethical researcher have to be very mindful of why you're removing these individuals and be aware that unless you're removing them for justifiable reasons, you really shouldn't be doing that, because the ability to replicate these studies are obliterated if you are massaging the data in this manner. Unfortunately, this again happens more often than we'd like to think. Another thing that many people do if they don't get that correlation that they're looking for, like you see here, is they just add a few people that they think maybe could tease it out a little bit more. They'll look for people that probably are going to fall in the extremes in the situation that they're looking for. So what was maybe a weak correlation to begin with could get them to where they're looking for. Or what they can also do is just get enough people and just get lucky enough to get enough of an overlap or correlation. And the first second they get that, they cut off the study. They stop it so they can ensure that nobody else will be added to mess with this best fit line or regression line that they've somehow been able to generate with the people that are participating in the study. This is obviously a huge issue. These issues with people massaging data or kind of altering data to get what they want. And to build on this, unfortunately, there are a lot of individuals nowadays with the internet and all the resources that we have available that take this unethical behavior a step further. Once they find what they're looking for or explore what they're interested in, they get lazy and they use the words or the research of others and kind of claim it as their own. And if you want to be a good researcher, a good ethical researcher, this is something that you have to avoid. It's not just about not doing harm to others, animals. It's also about not doing harm after you've done your research. Ensure that the information that you're conveying to people is accurate and not altered in a way that makes it unauthentic or kind of problematic and kind of doesn't tell the whole story. How do we ensure that we're doing this? How do we make sure that we can try to minimize how often this unethical behavior is occurring? Well, we've already talked about one big thing that we do, and that's having these things called institutional review boards. That's what we're going to be looking at a lot in our next class, our last real lecture that we have. But outside of that, there's other things that we've designed to try to kind of circumvent these problems. Once people have worked on their journals and worked with their school to ensure that they're trying to be as ethical as possible, there's actually a huge peer review process that takes place when people try to get this research published. Many journals, when they vet individuals who want to get published, actually have multiple professionals in an area comb through the research that people are trying to get published to ensure that people are not necessarily using the words of others, not messing with data, and not doing things that are considered unethical or problematic in that area that they're interested in getting published on. Another thing that's really been pushed recently, and this is related to the replication crisis that we talked about earlier, is that people are asked oftentimes now to, if they found something, replicate that. If you find something cool, show us you can find it again before it can get published. This is why lots of papers nowadays usually require not just one study to be a part of a paper, but multiple studies to be a part of that paper, to get a more complete and of nuanced story that can't often be just attributed to random chance. And to go even a step further, what many people are asked to do nowadays is keep that data in a very specific way so replication is possible, further analysis is possible. So people can really comb through what it is somebody found and ensure that they were being ethical in a number of different ways. And in fact, it's gotten so standardized that nowadays the APA really asks people to report data in very specific manners, analyses in very specific manners. So if somebody wants to not only replicate the study, but just check the work of somebody, they usually can do so just by combing through the data that somebody's presented. Not necessarily data that traces back to the participants themselves, but the data points that were used to actually run the analyses that somebody's running. Another thing that's become very commonplace when people are kind of checking the authenticity, the kind of ethical behavior of somebody while they're working on their paper is that there's lots of different plagiarism technology that's been developed over the years, not only for papers that say maybe you're writing for a class like this, but the papers that are trying to be published in dissertation books or journals, because unfortunately plagiarism is everywhere nowadays with all the different things that we have available to us. So one of the first classic plagiarism checkers that was out there was something called Dustball. So I always like to give that web link for individuals if they want to kind of see one of the first things that was trying to do this. But nowadays, there's lots of different plagiarism checkers that institutes have used to kind of try to curb this behavior and this tendency for people to unfortunately use the words and works of others as their own. And when done in combination with all the different things that we've talked about, what we're hoping to do is really minimize the unethical behavior that people can sometimes either unknowingly do or just do in a way that was kind of an afterthought, not intended to begin with, but because of the circumstances that it came about. And this is something that's becoming more and more prominent in most schools, and it requires more and more training to ensure that you are being ethical. And that's actually what we're going to be getting to now as we progress to our very last lecture, when we start getting a little bit more personal and talking about these things called institutional review boards, in particular, the institutional review boards and committees that we have in place here at Cal State East Bay. Uh, if we want to get even more specific, what we're going to also be talking about is these different human subjects studies and kind of trainings that you would go through if you were to do research here at Cal State East Bay, where you are required to do something called city training. So in our next class, we're going to give kind of an overview of what an IRB is, and then we'll walk through the basics of this thing called city training, and I'll even lay out the requirements for what you'll need to do if you do want to take advantage of an extra credit opportunity that we have in this class, where you can get city trained, which will not only get you, again, a few points for this class, but maybe help you get into a lab or two when you are trying to compete with other people, and you can kind of show that there's something that separates you from them. And for today, we're going to kind of close up. I'll see you one last time for our very last lecture, and again, focuses on IRBs and what's called city training. See you then.